this week,
Excuse me.
2 chapters, 17 and 18. So if you read 17 and didn't get to 18, it's because I didn't tell you. Next week, we are not doing this. We are having Ash Wednesday. And that service will be at 7 o'clock. 7 to 7:45. No Bible study. No food. You have to eat at home. The week after that, it will again be 2 chapters, 21 and 22, and we'll remind you of that. But next week is chapter 19, but we won't be doing a Bible study in 19. We'll be in chapter 20 and 21. So those are my only 2 announcements. Thank you, Carol. And of course, Mary has one because she wants to be the center of attention at all times.
She is our center of attention.
I brought her with me.
Your own groupie.
My own groupie. For anybody who has ever heard of the Blackwood Legacy or Blackwood Brothers, they are going to be in Merced this weekend. They're at the
Gateway.
Foursquare.
No,
they're at
that way.
wrong piece of paper. When you get old, you carry notes. They're called the New Legacy Project now, but 2 of the guys are the same that have always been there, and I think a couple of other ones are. It's Grace Community Foursquare Church. It's at 10 o'clock February 11th, which is this coming Sunday, and it's at 290 East Main Street. And I'm not familiar with that area, so I've not been down there either. But it's a free will offering, and they're fantastic. For anybody who's never seen them, they're really good. I'm going to go right after.
It's almost before you
We
get,
Martin Luther King in case.
yeah, and if you get to Motel Drive, you've gone too far.
Okay.
Should we go to that at 10,
Oh,
Pastor?
east.
It's
The other
east.
way.
It's
Sorry,
east,
it's
yeah.
the other way, yeah. No.
It's just a block south of East Campus. Yeah.
I was told no.
Thank you, Mary.
This is where you
But I'm
can
coming
see
here to see
the
you
Highway
first.
99 is a
That's
little
the
back
problem.
there.
It counts for something. You get extra
It's
credit
3
for that.
blocks from G Street going east.
So we continue the story. We're 18 chapters into a 31 chapter story. And it has been a while here that this country has been established. It was Abraham was called around 2000 BC, and here we are at about 645 is when the country of Israel gets ripped apart and drug off into who knows where. 722, the Assyrians or the Babylonians come in and drag off the people of Judah and Jerusalem, and that country is denuded of people. And so the country no longer exists, and it's that story that we see tonight as we see the story of Daniel. So let's play that.
The Israelites were now living in exile in Babylon, far away from home. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, selected a group of the most wealthy, educated Israelite men to study the Babylonian language and culture for 3 years, then put them to work in his royal court. In this group, there were 3 men named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They served the king faithfully, and the king placed them in powerful positions. Nebuchadnezzar wanted his people to worship him, so he built a 90-foot-tall gold statue of himself and commanded everyone in Babylon to worship him. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had committed themselves to only worshiping God. So when everyone else in Babylon bowed and worshipped to the statue, the 3 men stayed standing. Nebuchadnezzar was furious and sentenced them to be thrown into a fiery furnace and burned alive. The king ordered the furnace to be turned up to 7 times hotter than usual, so hot that even the guards who threw them into it were killed. Once the 3 men were inside, the king jumped up and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men we threw in? I now see 4 men, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." The king ordered the men to come out. When they did, everyone was amazed. Not only were they still alive, but they were in perfect condition. Not a hair on their heads had been burned. Once again, the king was impressed, and not only let the men go, but promoted them. Years later, a new king of Babylon, named Darius, came on the scene. A friend of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, named Daniel, who was also an Israelite, was so well liked by the new king that the other leaders in Babylon became jealous and hatched a plot to get rid of him. They tricked King Darius into signing a law that said Darius himself was a god and should be the only god anyone should worship for the next 30 days. Daniel heard about the law, but chose not to follow it. He went into an upstairs room in his home and looked out the windows facing toward Jerusalem, and he prayed to God 3 times a day. When the Babylonian leaders saw Daniel praying, they told King Darius, who was now forced to punish Daniel. He was arrested and thrown into a den full of lions overnight. In the morning, the den was opened, and Daniel was not only alive, there was not a scratch on him. Years later, after the Israelites had all been living in exile for 70 years, the Babylonians were overtaken by Persia, and the Israelites were allowed to return back to Jerusalem. They were going home.
So the story starts tonight in Jerusalem, which is about 500 miles from Babylon. So the distance from Jerusalem to Babylon is about the same distance as us to Las Vegas. That's a considerable distance for people to walk and ride their camels or whatever they're riding. That's a distance. But even more than that, you couldn't just cut straight through the desert. You had to go up north. And so the distance was a little closer to 1,000 miles. About the distance from here to Seattle, or here to Denver, Colorado. So it was a considerable separation for these guys and for this whole culture to be drugged out of Jerusalem. So they were taken to Babylon. Where do we first see Babylon in the Bible?
Tower of Babel.
The Tower of... Right, Stephanie, you were going to say that? Your hand went right up there, yes. We see it in the Tower of Babel. The people made the Tower of Babel about 2500 BC. So this is about 2500, 3,000 years later. And this city now is a considerable city. It's the center of the empire. It's a city of about 200,000 people, which is a pretty big city. They have walls that are 300 feet high. They have walls that are 80 feet thick. And walls that are sunk down into the ground 35 feet. So just think about the massive construction that it took and the massive defensive fortification that this was. This was a very, very powerful and scary empire and scary city. So about 722, they come across the desert and they plow into Jerusalem and they tear them apart. And they drag the people back there. And back to this city. Next slide. And again, this city is the center of the empire and a very scary, powerful culture that dominates the region. Now, what is Babylon known for? Anybody know?
Hanging garden.
The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world. That's kind of a throwaway that somebody invented in the 1600s, but there were seven major wonders of the world. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the lighthouse at Alexandria, Egypt, which fell down in an earthquake, and they actually have the stones for it in the ocean. What's the 7th wonder of the world that still exists today? The pyramids in Giza, in Egypt. Yeah. So this next picture is an assumption of what they may have looked like. They say it was a mountain of about 80 feet high, made of mud and bricks. Next slide there. I'm not really certain what it looks like. In fact, they're not even quite certain it's in Babylon. It may have been in Nineveh, but it certainly existed. And they used a technology that either came from the Chinese or had just been kind of modern to this area of screw pumps. Yeah, you can see how it's actually moving. Or the chain link pump. So they were able to create this fantastic building, and it impressed people terribly because it used all this modern technology that they had developed. This country too was very advanced in thought. You know, when you have that many people and that much money and that brutal a culture that you just go take everybody else's money, you can develop a lot of things. And so they did develop a very sophisticated legal system and communication system. There's a lot of writings they find from ancient Babylon that tell the story of what the culture was like. This last slide is a picture of what it looked like when the soldiers arrived in Jerusalem. I'm sure they gave them the best shot they could. But there were about 10,000 people that they deported from Jerusalem. They took the 10,000 educated people that would have brought some value to the empire. And then they left the poor and the destitute. They left them to fend for themselves here. And then a year later or so, there was a second deportation. They took another 1,500 people or so. So the Jerusalem was probably 10 or 15,000 people. Babylon, just the city, was a couple 100,000 people. In the context of today, of one country conquering another country, that would be like the United States conquering Zambia or Guatemala or Chile. That's the size difference between the two countries. So you can see Israel just had no hope when those guys came in and just wiped them out. And they did just wipe them out. They had no hope in themselves. But as we know, eventually the tables turned and they were allowed to go back, which is our next chapter, which we will not be studying next week because it's Palm Sunday. And we'll be eating
Ash
at
Wednesday.
home. Or Ash Wednesday. One of those, yeah, one of those church holidays. Ash Wednesday, you will be eating at home. Any questions on that? It was rough. Yeah, and it was rough. And I found the reading about how they treated the people to be very disturbing. And I'm okay with R-rated movies, but this was the way they treated people was rough. And they were known for putting rings in people's noses, rings in people's jaws, just piercing your actual jaw and dragging. And it was and that was unpleasant. The other stuff was really horrible. So it was not pretty. God allowed his people to really feel the brutal nature of the hand of a man, the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And he got his point across. Any questions on that? Well, let's watch Randy Frazie's video.
This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israel from the royal family and nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's place. He was to teach them the language and literatures of Babylonians. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. At the end of the time, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom.
We have come to chapter 18 of the story, one of my favorites. By God's sovereign choice, a young man named Daniel was forced to live in the space in between. Judah is living out a 70-year sentence of discipline for disobeying the commands of God and tainting his upper story reputation before the other nations. After the 70 years is up, God will open up the way for Judah to come back to Jerusalem and continue the plan to bring the world the Messiah. Daniel must live in this space that God has ordained for him to live with an upright heart. In the lower story, Daniel finds himself away from home. His home is Jerusalem. We learn in chapter 18 that the first group of people to be exiled are a group of young, elite men who are going to be trained as leaders in the ever-expanding pagan nation of Babylon. Here's a description of the men chosen. They are young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Daniel and his 3 friends, renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are chosen. They are likely teenagers around 16 to 18 years old. It must have been super tough for them to be stripped from their homes, their parents, at an age when most of us are thinking about driver's license and prom. As Daniel enters a 3-year-long officer's training program, he makes a resolve. I love the word resolve. Daniel resolved himself not to be defiled with the royal food and wine. His supervisors allowed Daniel and his 3 friends to take on an experiment for 10 days. For 10 days, they only ate vegetables and drank water. At the end of the 10 days, we are told that they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the rich royal food of the king. They ended up changing the diet of all the men to Daniel's vegetarian diet, which I'm sure made the men real happy. But it didn't stop with the diet. It bled over into other areas as well. Here's the report card we received on Daniel and his friends. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Daniel is teaching us as we walk on foreign soil, we must be resolved not to become addicted to the diet of our culture. We often think that we can't get away with this, that this is not how it works in the real world. Daniel and his friends didn't think this way. As a matter of fact, they proved that just maybe the culture will start mimicking your lifestyle over theirs. Now fast forward. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is arrogant, self-centered, and narcissistic. Not an uncommon thing in the secular world. Listen to this. He erects this 90-foot tall statue of none other than himself. Then he makes this decree. Anytime you hear music sounding, you are to stop in your tracks, bow down, and worship the statue. Anyone who fails to bow down will be thrown into a fiery furnace. Of course, Daniel and his friends refused to bow down to anyone but God. As office politics goes, there are some guys out to get Daniel and his friends, those goody two-shoes that cause them to eat broccoli and lettuce 3 times a day. So furious is the king that he turns up the heat on the furnace, making it 7 times hotter. Before the 3 men were thrown into the fire, they made this final declaration. If the God we serve is able to deliver us, then he will deliver us from the blazing furnace. But if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Now, where were these guys when they were looking for kings for Israel? Now listen to this. The 3 men fall into the furnace with hands bound. Nebuchadnezzar looks into the furnace, then he says, "Didn't we just throw 3 guys into the furnace?" "Yep," replies the subordinates. "Then why do I see 4 men walking around in the fire?" Not only are these 3 guys not consumed, there's a 4th guy with them just walking around. What are they doing? I see them high-fiving each other and doing chest bumps. Many scholars believe that the 4th person is none other than the pre-incarnate Jesus himself. One more story of the adventures of Daniel. Babylon has fallen to the Persian Empire. Now the new king of Persia is a guy named Darius, who really liked Daniel and promoted him to a significant position. Word gets out that the king is thinking of putting Daniel in charge of the whole kingdom. Who said you had to do wrong to rise? But as you can imagine, there are people who didn't like Daniel, who were jealous of his success. So they tried to set him up to fail. Here's how it reads in the story. At this, the administrators tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct of governmental affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Wow. How cool it would be if the only thing that people could pin on me was how deeply devoted I was to God. They go to the king and pull a fast one over on him and hit him where most leaders are weak. They stroke his ego. They have him sign a decree which couldn't be reversed that stated that anyone who prayed to any other god or man besides Darius during the next 30 days would be thrown into the lion's den. Darius agreed. Daniel got the paperwork on the deal, but it did not deter him in prayer to Yahweh 3 times a day with his windows open toward Jerusalem, his real home. Of course, Daniel is caught. The king is distraught that his little charade will cost Daniel his life, but there's nothing he could do about it. Daniel was thrown into a den of hungry lions, and a huge rock was placed over the pit. In the morning, the king rushes to the pit to see if God saved him. And he did. Not a scratch on his body. In the lower story, the king throws me into a lion's den for not bowing down to him. In the upper story, the King of Kings closes the mouth of the lions for bowing only to him. Here's the big deal. The way Daniel and his 3 friends lived their lives on foreign soil, secular territory, pointed people to God. Here is what Nebuchadnezzar said of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Listen to what Darius said about Daniel after they pulled him out of the den. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and revere the God of Daniel. For this is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. You know, we're really in the same position as Daniel, aren't we? In the lower story, Daniel finds himself away from home. His home is Jerusalem. In the upper story, we find ourselves away from home. Our home is the new Jerusalem. Therefore, as we walk on foreign soil, we must be resolved not to become addicted to the diet of our culture. In the lower story, the world may throw me into a den of lions or into a fiery furnace for not bowing down to them. But in the upper story, the King of Kings will stand with me and shut the mouth of the lions for only bowing to him. And if he doesn't save me, I have no regrets, following him with my whole heart. And if we are courageous enough to align our lives to the upper story of God in this way, we too will be responsible for pointing people to God. I love the way Peter puts it to us. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Maybe we should all grab a piece of broccoli and a glass of water and ponder this just a little while.
Great story, isn't that? When I teach on the Old Testament, I've always traditionally said, there's really no good guys in the Old Testament. They all have some fault that comes out, and they're decent. They attempt to follow God, but they just have all failed. But Daniel seems to be, I think, one exception to that. I don't see him really at fault here. I think he's pretty successful, or at least the story is. What special diet does Daniel request from the king's chief official? Royal meat and wine, fruits and vegetables, vegetables and water, manna and quail. Vegetables and water. Broccoli, that's right. What amazed the officials when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fiery furnace? Not a hair on their head was singed. Their robes were not scorched. They did not smell like smoke. All of the above. Pretty amazing. Why was Daniel thrown into the den of lions? He refused to bow down to the golden idol of the king. He prayed to his God 3 times a day. Jealous enemies brought false accusations. All of the above. Right, good. B. Do you have these answers in your book? Did you check?
They are there, but I didn't check them. Brandon said that.
What prophet predicted the return of the Israelites from captivity? Jeremiah, Hezekiah, Ezekiel, Hosea. We have a Jeremiah. Do I hear Hosea? Do I hear Nehemiah? Do I hear Frank? Fred, that's right, it's Fred. That's what. That's Jeremiah. Yep. What impressed you in that story? Just, it's not in your book, but just, what impressed you in that story tonight?
They're going to be exiled for 70 years, so that's kind of like the generation thing with the 40 years in the desert.
Yeah, you know, that struck me too, George. You know, 40 years in the desert was a generation, and there were only 3 people or 2 people left after that started out and finished. But after 70 years, you've got multiple generations. So all the people who started out in Jerusalem and were drugged to Babylon are dead. Their children may be dead, and their grandchildren are the ones that get to go back. Yeah, that really, they really stamped out whatever it was that was trying to stamp out. It's a long time. 70 years ago, that was what, like 1950? 1960? 1947? It's a long time. Not that being 70 is a long time.
Yeah,
Let me just, never mind here. Let's just go to page, yeah, thank you. 154. What can we learn from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego about their response to the king's demand that the individuals be worshipped? What can we learn from them, from that demand?
Stand up for what you believe.
Now, I don't know. Stand up for what you believe and get thrown in a furnace.
Right.
God will protect.
What's that?
God will protect, no matter what.
Courage is beyond you. Yeah. Yeah. Now, does God always protect?
No. But they did in their case.
But he did, didn't he? Yeah. Yeah.
I like the end of that. If, our God can keep us out of that, but even if he doesn't, he is no less our God.
And he's still protecting you, whether he gives you what you want or not.
Yeah, and what do you mean by that, Megan?
Safe in his arms.
You give prayers all the time to God, and you may think they're unanswered, but it's just not the answer that you wanted, but he's still protecting you and leading you to where he wants you to be, not where you want to be.
Which it may be dead.
But if that's where God wants you to be, then
Yeah, and so I'm pushing back on you because I think that there's a certain belief in a lot of Christian circles that, if I just pray to God, he will protect me, and that means that I won't be killed. And that means that I won't be hurt. And that means that it'll all work out well for me. And I think the answer is just what you said, is that he will put us where he wants us. And maybe that's outside of the furnace with nothing burnt, or maybe that's dead.
But I like Romans 8:28. All things happen for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. No matter what it appears on the outside, everything is happening for good.
Yes. And I thank you for saying that, Carol. I think that passage says that God has control and he has a place for us. And if that's serving or being the example and transforming a king or being the burned up skeleton, that that there's a purpose in his plans there. Yeah.
I see that when people lose a child or something. You want to say, how could God let this happen? But their faith, the child's faith going through it, the doctors, the nurses, all the people, if you stand back and look, you are amazed at what this little guy's death might have done for so many in that situation.
We are so inclined to try to say, something good will come from this, and we can't always see it. Now, you're kind of stepping in here, yeah, and it does. It pulls the best out of us, and it touches us.
I think we see it now because of our age. When we were younger, I'm sure I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Not at all. My faith has grown, my age, my maturity has grown. So
Yeah.
we see more good from what other people might consider bad.
And this is what we as Lutherans call the theology of the cross, which I won't get into because it's so confusing. But essentially, we call what's good bad and what's bad good. When a child dies, everybody says, "Well, that's horrible," because we know, because children aren't supposed to die, and it feels hideous. But God has bigger plans, and he is working, and who knows what comes out of that. he has his ways, and we can't stand up and condemn and say, it shouldn't be this way because we're not God, even though we want to be.
And sometimes there's far worse things than death, I believe.
Far worthless things than death, yes. Boy, again, reading the story of how the Babylonians treated their prisoners, yes, there were things far worse than death. Daniel faced the difficult decision of whether or not to defy the king's edict for worship. How can you foresee ways you might face a similar decision in our society today to make a radical stand for your faith? Mary?
When you see something bad going on, don't join in. If you have anything you can do to help defuse a situation that's very bad, do it. My husband's sure I'm going to get shot for doing that, but
You may.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah, you've got kind of the mentality of, you know, you're kind of a rescue, stand up for the right thing regardless, come hell or high water gal. So, yep, we may have that conversation. Rosalie?
Going to school here, it was very different for me because some places you cannot express your faith. If you carry a cross or something, people will just look at you. This is an offense to me. Even like in our hospital, it's a Catholic hospital. We are encouraged to pray, and we have chaplain, but in a lot of places they don't. And they don't encourage. Even our marketing person was just teasing at the end of the year, and he was saying, "Oh, I'm going to send you Merry Christmas," because people are just taking that as offensive. So I think the society is changing, and it's really becoming very difficult for the younger generation to express their faith, because all this, rules that people think that's prejudice.
Yeah, jumping ahead to my question here. I worked in the financial industry for a company called Dean Witter. Dean Witter was a local American company out of Oakland, actually. It started in Oakland. But a national company, it's an American company. We were bought by Morgan Stanley, an international company. And we had very specific dictates that we could not talk about anything faith-related in the building. Because they didn't want to offend the Muslims or the whoever, the Buddhists, everybody else. So yeah, that's, as we become more international and less Christian as a society.
And working in that field, that's very interesting because we don't agree with abortion, but if you work in a place that you, as a nurse, have to go there and help with abortion, and it's against your beliefs, you have no choice because that's your assignment. So, or even like places that agree with euthanasia, you have to go there and help somebody to die, but if you don't feel comfortable with that, then you're without word.
Yeah, so what used to be widely acknowledged as unacceptable, abortion and euthanasia, you're now being required by your job to do, and if you don't, you're subject to economic. So what do you do?
We'll have to find another place to work. That's what it would be.
So hang on. So you have a value system that says you will not help with abortion and you will not help with euthanasia, and you believe that's God's word, I'm assuming. Okay. You are also a mother, and you have a family, and let's just take you out of it. Let's say you are a single mother, and you are providing for your family, and this job is how you pay for that. That is a God-given job. You are a nurse by vocation, prepared to be that by God. You are serving the world. And if you were to walk away from that vocation, you are no longer following your job. You are no longer taking care of your child. You're no longer doing what God calls you to do. So what's the right thing to do here?
Go to the house, do another thing, that's not what I would do. I would just find something else that it doesn't go against my belief system.
So your beliefs on abortion and euthanasia are stronger than your beliefs on providing for your child.
You can always work at McDonald's.
You just trust God's gonna take care of you.
You
Okay.
pray for direction from God.
And good, and I thank you. I thank you because I think that's the conclusion. Yeah, it's not always this is the right answer and this is the wrong answer, so I'm going to do the right answer. It's not always that easy. But sometimes you have to follow what you believe is right. And if you just and maybe that means you help with abortions because nobody else will, and these young girls are going to have them that are going to die. And that's your job, as despicable as it may be. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's I just can't do that. Fire me. I'm going to go work at McDonald's.
I think that when you're faced with some of these decisions that are so against your belief, you really have to go into prayer. And what I've always done is I prayed very hard for days. And then one night I prayed and say, okay, God, the first thing I think of in the morning, that's what I'm going to do. I narrowed it down after 3 or 4 days of the issue and praying. Then first thing I wake up and I think of that subject and I think, oh, I need to quit my job, then that's what I would do. If it's no, you can help more by sustaining and letting people see your belief and explaining it. And yes, I will do my job, but I want you to know I am not in favor and this is why. And you can spread the message another way, then that would be what I would do. And you're going to get fired? Well, not necessarily. It depends on how you handle it. If you're willing to still do your job.
Except for.
No, do the job, but let the
Yeah.
people know how you feel.
Okay. So let's talk about that because Rosalie, your action is you're going to lose your job, and you may. Let's look at Daniel. Did he lose his job?
No. Well, not after the fact, no.
He got thrown in the lion's den. So I think they probably said, okay, he's no longer doing that job because he's dead.
But Daniel didn't live in the 21st century where people can be replaced very easily.
But it's the same principle.
I don't know. I don't know if things are that different. I mean, I think it's really easy for us to think, well, it's different now. It's really not.
But God could even put you in a different job where you can express your faith easier and reach more people too. We don't know.
Right. And frankly, and we see Daniel saying, this is where I stand. This is what I'm going to do. Kill me if you have to. Promote me if you want to. But this is right. We don't see him saying, you're a sinner because you, whatever. He's not offending anybody. He's simply doing his job. And 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give a reason for your hope with, what are those 2 words? Gentleness and respect. When you stand up for what you believe in, and you tell the whole world they're stupid because they don't believe that way, you don't make a lot of friends. When you stand for what you believe in and say, this is where I stand, I got to do this. Martin Luther, I can do no less. People, even when they disagree with it, they respect that. And when you don't offend them, in Daniel's case, the king said, wow, this guy this is the guy. So what looks to be tragedy, and I certainly understand Rosalie's position here, may turn into brilliant proclamation. And you may get credited with being a person of principle. And those are few and far between. That was actually the big discussion I wanted to have about this case study, about that.
But if we pray and we stay connected to God, whatever the situation may be, and let Him handle it. Just like I don't know what to do. I don't know, I really don't know what to do. I leave myself and my body in your hands. And, just keep praying and this and that and trust God to have you do the right thing. Is that a wrong way to look at it?
That's exactly, what do you think? I mean, isn't that what He calls us to do? Trust in Him. I love what you said about I'm going to pray on it, and then Lord, I got to make a decision. So when I wake up, whatever you tell me is I'm going to trust is it, and then you do it. And if it's wrong, well, that's not.
Well, they told me to marry him, so we do have
So sometimes it may work, and sometimes. And you did very well.
Oh, yeah.
Woke up that morning with this picture right there. God wants us to trust Him, and when you're taking that tack, George, you can't go wrong with that.
Because even if I mess it up, He knows that I'm trying not to mess it up. I'm involving Him in the decision and allowing Him to, He could kill me going out. And it's like, hey, you could kill me going out the door. You could leave me there. You could take me out. Whatever happens is going to happen, but I'm just going to keep muddling on.
I do kind of remember when I was working, I had a problem with a coworker, and I didn't want to go to work. And you're praying, okay, Lord, I don't want to go to work today. Oh my gosh, I have to handle this issue again. And she's rude and blah, 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 blah. And then I go, okay, I'm just going in, God. It's up to you. And you get to working before you know it. You're working a day, and the day has ended, and it was not horrible at all. So you never know how God's going to lead you. You have to leave it to Him. And even if there had been a discussion that day, who knows? But I really did trust God. It's going to be all right. I'm just going to go to work and do my job, and it was all right.
She probably got fired, huh?
That's right. Somebody put poison in her tea. I think this is an important issue because we all have vocations. We all have jobs. We are parents. We are children. We are citizens. We are neighbors. We are spouses. We are nurses. We are teachers. We are business people, whatever that is. We all have these vocations. And those vocations are how God serves the world. He works through you to care for the patients. He works through you to harvest the almonds. That's God at work through you. And that is your place in the world. That's how He is using you. And when we go to it and say, okay, God, use me today to teach these little kids, and it's a crummy day, well, okay, it was a crummy day. When we go at it and say, I'm going to go be fulfilled today, and if I'm not fulfilled because I have this really annoying person that I have to work with, or I have to do something that I don't really like to do or don't even believe I should have, whatever, then we're looking at ourselves and we're missing that our vocation is God-given and not us given. Page 157 here. Daniel blank himself not to be defiled by the royal food and wine.
Resolve.
Daniel blank himself not to be defiled by the royal food and wine.
Resolve.
Resolved. Thank you, Carolyn. Anyone who fails to bow down will be thrown into a fiery furnace. Good. Who says you have to do blank to rise? That was one of the throwaway comments at the end there.
Wrong.
Wrong. Thank you. In the upper story, the King of Kings closes the mouths of lions for bowing blank to him. That's a goofy sentence. Only him. In the upper story, the King of Kings closes the mouths of lions for bowing only to him. Next, final one. If he doesn't save me, I have no regrets. I think this gets to, God, save me. If your will is to save me, please do. And if your will is to take me, feed me to the lions, then please make it quick. Spend the last few minutes on this case study here on the bottom of page 158. Lynn had been with the company for 8 years, and her annual reviews reflected a hardworking, conscientious team player. That's why her recent encounter with her supervisor, Christine, surprised her. Lynn had always had a few regular practices at work. Over her lunch hour, she would often take out her Bible and work on her Bible study. She also frequently ended conversations with coworkers with the phrase, "Have a blessed day." Occasionally, other employees would come to her sharing a request to pray for a life crisis, and Lynn always promised to pray for them. Now, Christine has taken Lynn into her office to say, "A lot of your coworkers have been complaining about how you are so vocal about your faith in the workplace. Your prayers and comments and having your Bible out on your desk have made some of them describe this as a hostile work environment. I'm going to need you to stop doing these things."
Are you kidding me? That would probably be my reaction, which would be 2 weeks' notice.
I was going to say, which is why you don't work there. Or you will for only a very short time.
You'd hang around for 2 weeks, I don't see that.
Yeah. It's put your things in this box and please walk with the security guard out the door.
I'll
George?
admit, I was a supervisor that had to do that. I didn't have, well, I did do that.
Had to fire people for faith
No, I
issues?
didn't fire him, but I had to bring him in the office and tell him, hey,
What,
you are offending people and with your faith, and had a long discussion with him. I never threatened to fire him or anything, but I told him, this is not the place for that. If you're really concerned about him, pray for him quietly on your, and this and that, but trying to push faith on people in a work environment that don't want it day after day. Day is offensive, and it actually doing more harm than it is if you quietly pray for them and this and that.
So how was it being a tool of Satan?
No.
Well, it's not pleasant, and this is one of those things where you pray to God,
That's a great story, George. Yeah, so...
and I hate to admit that, and I hate to say it in front of all these people.
Well,
but
I think
did do it.
what you just said was, I think, really wise. And by the way, it's paraphrasing. And by the way, I'm a Christian, and you're doing more damage than you are helping by what you're
But
doing.
he did it even nicer than that.
Yeah,
He just said, pray for them.
right. And I think that as Christians, that is really wise and helpful thing. You had to do it for business reasons.
Well, I did it because I did it for the other employees. I'm strong in my faith. There was a lot of us guys were really faithful and we knew one another and we prayed, and this and that. There was other people that didn't want to hear about it and they didn't want to be bothered with it. And I have to serve both. I have to serve all the people in my organization.
You do, and because those guys who are not faithful, are not Christians, could care less about Jesus, are being used by God to provide food for the rest of us. They don't know
They
it.
had their own faith, and they didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, and that's right. God is still using them to function in the world and to do something that serves His people. They don't have to hear. We have a job. We have a job to do, and that is to obey the laws. The laws of the land prevent that, and so you've got. That's the right thing you have to do.
So was it against the law or company policies for this, in this case study, for that gal to do her Bible study on her own lunch hour. And, you know, who is she offending? If other people knew that she was Christian, and why couldn't they go up to her and say, pray for me, or
Stuart, you have your hand up? Or?
Absolutely. No, and yes. So again, what it would be, the hostile work environment is a trigger word in
Yes.
certain state of California.
Yes.
So somebody complains about hostile work environment, there are legal obligations that an employer has to follow up.
Yeah, it's harassment. I mean, the guy could have been an Amway salesman, you know, and they told him, no, I don't want to do it, but he continued to pester him. It becomes hostile.
So we live in a very
Whatever it is,
sensitive, what's that?
whatever it is, that they continuously try to push upon them when they've been asked not to.
And I think that's a really good analogy. It could be an Amway salesman. That's a great thought. Because we live in an environment where people are very sensitive to being annoyed.
It's their break time, and they want to take a break without being harassed.
Mary?
To me, one of the key words in there is she was doing her Bible study at her desk. And that was a complaint of theirs. Fine, go out in the car, go into the lunchroom, the break room, wherever, and sit in the corner and do it. I mean, there's ways of doing it. It's like you said about wearing a cross, if that offends people.
See, we are living in a time when this isn't just about faith, it's about everything. Are you familiar with the term microaggression? Microaggression are things people do that don't intend to be aggressive, but people receive them as aggressive. One that gets a lot of press is if I'm playing with a piece of string on my desk and I made a noose, and somebody saw that noose, that has been so associated with black African American discrimination that they could see that as a microaggression. These are all, for wearing a cross, Rosalie, could be considered me imposing that on you. There was a story here about a month ago about a group of guys. They were wearing white shirts, and white shirts were seen in this population in either the school or in this business as the shirt that was worn by the owners of the companies who were Caucasian and who were discriminating against people who were not. And so just the wearing of a white shirt became prohibited because people were, yeah. I mean, this is where the microaggression thing just runs off the rails.
Can't people just grow up?
No, they can't.
It's a society is cyclical like that. Because of the Victorian time, it's kind of like that too. And it was, and they actually go back to the formation of this country with a lot of the stereotypes around the Puritan exile. Puritan exile was like formed by a lot of the concept of tiny little things that would be satanic or not satanic.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that analogy. Ironic, I heard that from an Englishman. But that's really interesting. That's actually quite encouraging because I think this microaggression thing is just horrible. And to know that we've been down this road before is actually kind of encouraging. We might get past it. But that's the world we're living in. And so we either get back in their face and say, you're stupid, or we, with gentleness and respect. Well, good topic. It's 7:30 and I'm getting for my technical director back there.
As long as we're in church, can I ask for one prayer request? I have a friend who just found out she's got breast cancer. She goes to see an oncologist tomorrow. That isn't the worst part. The worst part is she is terrified. Absolutely terrified. So please pray for her.
I hope you have a moment to offer her some comfort.
I've been on the phone with her a couple times and all.
Just don't pray.
I asked her if she
What is her
wanted to
name?
go along. Not yet.
What's her first name? What's her initial?
Anna.
Ann.
Ann is in Nancy.
Ann is in Nancy. Let's just...
Well, her name's Norma.
Norma. Good. Let's pray for Norma and we'll get out of here. How's that? Dear Lord, We are your people. We are in your story, and we see how you are a constant source of love and encouragement and promise and hope in every day, and that you have roles for all of us, and sometimes they're to rise above all the sin in this world, and sometimes they're to be taken by it, but you are always with us, one way or the other. We ask you to be with Norma and hold her tight, offer her comfort that she is not alone in this. May Mary and others be your face to her, speak your words to her, and offer your hope to her. Please be with us as we travel home. Give us a quiet night and peaceful sleep. In Jesus' name.
Amen.